For 4 decades, the story of global manufacturing was simple. Move production to wherever labor is cheapest. China became the world's factory.
Bombs,
Bangladesh
bullet,
stitched our clothes.
just collapse.
Vietnam assembled our electronics.
Economic war
Companies chased lower wages across borders, and entire industrial regions in America and Europe hollowed out. We were told this was inevitable, irreversible, the natural evolution of a global economy. Factory jobs weren't coming back. Manufacturing was a relic of the past. Get used to it. But something remarkable is happening right now. Something that contradicts everything we've been told about globalization. Manufacturing is coming home. Companies that spent decades building supply chains in Asia are now investing billions to build factories in the United States, Europe, and other high-wage countries. In 2023 alone, over $200 billion in manufacturing construction was announced in the United States, nearly triple the previous record. Intel, TSMC, Samsung are building semiconductor facilities. Battery plants are sprouting across the Midwest. Pharmaceutical production is returning. This isn't a trickle, it's a wave. What changed? Why are companies suddenly willing to pay American or European workers $25 an hour instead of Chinese workers $5 an hour? The answer isn't what you think. It's not patriotism, not government subsidies alone, not even tariffs, though all these play roles. The real story is far more fundamental. The entire economic model that justified offshoring has collapsed. The myth of cheap labor, the idea that low wages alone determine where production happens, is dead. And understanding why this myth died reveals everything about the future of work, the reshaping of global trade, and which countries will thrive in the coming decades. Point 1. The hidden costs, when cheap labor becomes expensive. Let's start by demolishing the core assumption that drove offshoring, that labor costs are the only costs that matter. For years, the calculation seemed straightforward. An American factory worker costs $25 to $30 per hour with benefits. A Chinese factory worker costs $5 to $8 per hour. Simple math says move production to China and pocket the difference. Millions of jobs moved based on this calculation. Entire industries vanished from Western countries. But this calculation was always incomplete, and now the hidden costs have become impossible to ignore. First, there's transportation. When you manufacture in China for American consumers, you must ship products across the Pacific Ocean. A single container that cost $2,000 to ship in 2019 cost over $20,000 at the peak of the post-pandemic logistics crisis. Even now, with prices normalized, shipping costs eat into the labor savings. And it's not just the money, it's the time. Ocean freight takes 4 to 6 weeks. In a world where consumer preferences change rapidly and inventory sitting in transit represents dead capital, that time is increasingly unacceptable. Then there's inventory management. When your supply chain stretches 8,000 miles, you can't operate just-in-time manufacturing. You need enormous buffer stocks, warehouses full of components and finished products to guard against disruptions. This ties up massive amounts of capital. A company might save on labor but lose those savings to the working capital locked in inventory sitting in warehouses and on ships. Quality control is another hidden cost. When manufacturing happens halfway around the world, ensuring quality is exponentially harder. You need inspectors on site, more rigorous testing, higher defect rates, and occasional disasters where entire production runs must be scrapped. A pharmaceutical company discovered this painfully when contaminated ingredients from overseas suppliers led to massive recalls and billions in losses. The cheap manufacturing suddenly became catastrophically expensive. Intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer have cost Western companies hundreds of billions over the years. When you manufacture in certain countries, you're essentially required to share your technology with local partners, who then become your competitors. That cheap labor comes with giving away the innovations that represent years of R&D investment. Add up transportation, inventory costs, quality control, IP losses, and the hidden expenses of managing complex global supply chains, and suddenly that wage differential doesn't look so compelling. A worker in Ohio might cost $25 per hour versus $7 in China, but when total costs are considered, especially with automation reducing the labor component, the gap narrows dramatically. Companies are running the numbers again, and the answer is changing. Point 2. The automation revolution, when robots don't care about wages. Here's the factor that's fundamentally rewriting the economics of manufacturing. Automation. For decades, companies moved to low-wage countries because manufacturing was labor-intensive. Dozens or hundreds of workers assembled products by hand. Labor costs dominated the expense structure. But modern manufacturing increasingly doesn't work that way. Walk into a cutting-edge semiconductor fabrication plant and you'll see a facility that costs $20 billion to build and employs only a few hundred highly skilled technicians. The actual manufacturing is done by extraordinarily sophisticated machines that deposit atomic layers with nanometer precision. Whether this facility is in Arizona or Taiwan, the labor cost per chip is nearly identical because there's barely any labor involved. The expensive part is the machinery, the engineering talent, and the capital investment, not assembly workers. This pattern is spreading across manufacturing. Automotive plants that once required thousands of workers now use robotic assembly lines where machines do welding, painting, and installation with precision no human can match. A Tesla factory employs far fewer people per vehicle than a traditional auto plant, but those it employs are engineers, technicians, and skilled workers maintaining advanced equipment. Even in industries traditionally dependent on manual labor, automation is arriving. Textile manufacturing, long outsourced to Bangladesh and Vietnam, is seeing robotic sewing machines that can handle complex garments. 3D printing is beginning to produce components that previously required extensive hand assembly. Warehouses are deploying autonomous robots that move inventory, reducing the need for human material handlers. Here's why this matters for reshoring. When labor is 5% of manufacturing costs instead of 30%, wage differences become trivial. If labor is only 5% of your costs, paying $25 per hour instead of $5 per hour adds only 1% to total production costs. Suddenly, having manufacturing near your customers, near your engineering teams, in countries with stable rule of law and intellectual property protection, becomes far more valuable than chasing the lowest wages. The automation revolution doesn't eliminate jobs, it changes them. Modern factories need fewer people, but those people need higher skills. They're programming industrial robots, maintaining sophisticated equipment, managing automated systems. These are $60,000 to $100,000 per year jobs, not minimum wage positions. This is why manufacturing employment can return to rich countries even as absolute job numbers don't match historical levels. The manufacturing that's returning is high value, high skill, and increasingly automated. Point 3. The geopolitical wake-up call. When supply chains become weapons. If economics were the only factor, the shift back might be gradual. But geopolitics has slammed its fist on the table and demanded immediate attention. The past few years have taught corporate boardrooms and government officials a lesson they won't forget. Extended supply chains through potentially hostile or unstable regions are not just risky, they're existential threats. COVID-19 provided the first brutal lesson. When China locked down in early 2020, global supply chains seized up almost instantly. Companies discovered that critical components, semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, industrial machinery came from single factories in single regions that suddenly couldn't produce or ship. Auto manufacturers shut down, not because they couldn't build cars, but because they couldn't get $2 chips. The world's most sophisticated corporations discovered they had no idea how fragile their supply chains actually were. Then came the semiconductor shortage, which lasted for years and cost industries hundreds of billions in lost production. Companies realized that 90% of advanced semiconductors came from Taiwan and South Korea, an incredible concentration of critical technology in a geopolitically tense region. What happens if there's a conflict over Taiwan? What happens if China decides to blockade the island? Suddenly, having all your chips manufactured 6,000 miles away in a potential war zone seems insane. The Ukraine war reinforced these lessons. Europe discovered its dependence on Russian energy was a strategic catastrophe. Companies with operations in Russia lost billions in stranded assets overnight. Businesses worldwide learned that geopolitical disruptions can shut down entire supply chains with zero warning. Governments have responded with unprecedented intervention. The United States passed the CHIPS Act, providing $52 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Europe launched similar initiatives. Countries are offering massive incentives for critical manufacturing: batteries, pharmaceuticals, rare earth processing, advanced materials, to come home. This isn't protectionism for its own sake. It's strategic recognition that in an unstable world, supply chain resilience is national security. For companies, the calculation has changed. Yes, manufacturing in Asia might be somewhat cheaper, but what's the value of supply chain security? What's it worth to know that a regional conflict, pandemic, or political decision 8,000 miles away can't shut down your production? Increasingly, companies are deciding that premium is worth paying. They're diversifying supply chains, bringing critical production home, and accepting somewhat higher costs in exchange for reliability and control. Point 4. The China factor. When your factory becomes your competitor. There's another reason the manufacturing exodus is reversing, and it's specific to China, the country that captured the lion's share of offshored production over the past 3 decades. The bargain that brought companies to China is falling apart, and companies are realizing they've created their own competitors. For years, the deal was simple. China offered cheap labor, good infrastructure, supply chain clusters where hundreds of suppliers congregated, and a massive domestic market. In exchange, foreign companies had to form joint ventures with Chinese partners, share technology, and train local workforces. Companies accepted this, viewing it as the cost of accessing the China opportunity. But something fundamental changed. Chinese companies that started as contract manufacturers or joint venture partners have become global competitors. The technology that was supposed to remain proprietary has, through various means, ended up in Chinese competitors' hands. Companies that went to China to manufacture products now find themselves competing against Chinese firms making similar products with the technology and expertise gained from those partnerships. Huawei started with Western telecom technology. BYD went from making batteries for foreign companies to becoming one of the world's largest EV manufacturers. Chinese drone maker DJI dominates globally, built on manufacturing expertise originally gained from foreign partners. The pattern repeats across industries. Foreign companies train Chinese partners and workers. Chinese companies use that knowledge to build competing businesses, then leverage lower costs and government support to undercut the original foreign companies. Intellectual property protection in China, despite official improvements, remains a serious concern. Trade secret theft, forced technology transfer, and cyber espionage have cost Western companies hundreds of billions. Companies are finally doing the math. Is the manufacturing cost saving worth handing your technology to future competitors? Additionally, China's labor costs aren't what they used to be. Chinese factory wages have risen dramatically. In some coastal regions, they're now comparable to Mexico or Eastern Europe. The wage advantage that justified accepting all the other risks has narrowed significantly. Meanwhile, China's demographic crisis, a rapidly aging population due to decades of the one-child policy, means labor shortages are emerging. The endless supply of cheap young workers that powered China's manufacturing boom is disappearing. Companies are responding by diversifying out of China. Not abandoning the country entirely, the domestic market is too important, but reducing dependence. Manufacturing is moving to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and increasingly back to developed countries. Apple is pushing suppliers to build capacity in India. Samsung has shifted production to Vietnam. Automakers are building plants in Mexico and the United States. The era of all eggs in the China basket is ending. Point 5. The nearshoring advantage, when speed and flexibility matter more than cost. The final nail in the coffin of pure wage chasing is the changing nature of manufacturing itself. The products companies make today aren't the same as products from 30 years ago, and the way consumers demand them has fundamentally changed. This new reality favors manufacturing close to end markets, what's called nearshoring or reshoring. Modern products have shorter life cycles. A smartphone model is obsolete in a year. Fashion trends change by the season. Consumer preferences shift rapidly. In this environment, being able to respond quickly is worth more than squeezing every penny out of labor costs. A factory in Kentucky can adjust production in days. A factory in Shenzhen takes weeks or months to pivot, and by then, the opportunity might be gone. Customization and personalization are increasingly important. Consumers want products tailored to their preferences. Custom colors, configurations, personalized features. This kind of flexible, small-batch manufacturing is much harder to coordinate across oceans. Having manufacturing near design teams and close to customers enables rapid iteration and customization that distant factories can't match. Sustainability concerns are also driving reshoring. Consumers and regulations increasingly demand lower carbon footprints. Shipping products halfway around the world is carbon-intensive. Manufacturing locally reduces transportation emissions significantly. European regulations are beginning to penalize high-carbon supply chains. Companies see onshore manufacturing as both environmentally responsible and a way to meet emerging regulatory requirements. There's also the talent clustering advantage. Manufacturing innovation happens when engineers, designers, and production workers collaborate closely. When your design team is in California and your factory is in China, that collaboration is difficult. Time zones don't align, language barriers exist, and travel is expensive and time-consuming. When manufacturing returns home, the feedback loop between design and production accelerates. Problems get solved faster, innovations implement quicker, and products improve continuously. The COVID-era experience with remote work taught companies that some things can't be done effectively across vast distances. Manufacturing is one of them. The tacit knowledge, the quick problem-solving, the rapid iteration, these work best when people are in proximity. Companies that brought manufacturing home found their innovation cycles accelerated and product quality improved. So here we are, witnessing the death of a myth that shaped 4 decades of economic policy and corporate strategy. The myth was seductive in its simplicity. Find the cheapest labor, move production there, maximize profit. It seemed like an iron law of economics, an unstoppable force of globalization. Entire industries, communities, and countries restructured themselves around this supposed truth. But the myth is dead because it was always incomplete. It counted labor costs while ignoring transportation, inventory, quality, IP protection, supply chain resilience, speed to market, innovation cycles, and geopolitical risk. It assumed manufacturing would always be labor-intensive, not recognizing that automation would fundamentally change the cost equation. It underestimated the strategic importance of supply chain security in an unstable world. It ignored the costs of creating your own competitors. Manufacturing is moving back not because of nostalgia for a mythical industrial past, not because politicians suddenly got smart, and not just because of government subsidies, though these help. It's moving back because the fundamental economics changed. When you run the numbers honestly, accounting for all costs, many products now make more sense to manufacture near where they're consumed, in advanced economies with skilled workers, automation capabilities, strong IP protection, and stable governance. This doesn't mean every job is coming back. Modern manufacturing is more automated, employing fewer but more skilled workers. Not every industry is reshoring. Commodity products with stable designs will still chase low costs. And manufacturing won't return to every community it left. It's clustering in regions with the right infrastructure, workforce, and industry ecosystems. But the trend is real and accelerating. The $200+ billion in manufacturing construction announced in the US in 2023 isn't symbolic. It's the largest industrial investment boom in generations. Similar patterns are emerging in Europe and other developed economies. The global manufacturing map is being redrawn, and this time, proximity, resilience, speed, and technology matter more than raw labor costs. For workers, this is complex news. The returning jobs are different, higher skilled, better paid, but fewer in number. For countries, it's an opportunity to rebuild industrial capacity, but with different requirements. Invest in automation, workforce training, infrastructure, and stable policy environments. For companies, it's a recognition that the race to the bottom on wages was always going to hit bottom eventually, and that true competitive advantage comes from innovation, speed, quality, and resilience, not just cheap hands. The myth of cheap labor is dead. What's being born is a new manufacturing paradigm where location strategy is about total cost, supply chain security, innovation speed, and flexibility. The factories are coming home, but they won't look like the factories that left. And that's exactly why they're coming back.